In the winter of 1944, a German test pilot named Hans Werner Lerche climbed into the cockpit of an American fighter at a secret airfield near Berlin. The aircraft was a North American P-51 Mustang, captured intact after its pilot made a forced landing in Austria. Lerche had flown approximately 125 different aircraft types during the war without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single machine. He was one of the most skilled evaluation pilots in the Luftwaffe, a qualified engineer as well as an aviator who approached each new aircraft with methodical precision. What he discovered during that test flight would confirm the worst fears of German military leadership. 700 miles to the west, formations of those same Mustangs were escorting American bombers over the heart of the Reich. For the first time in the war, enemy fighters could fly from England to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe had no adequate response. The defensive strategy that had worked against unescorted bomber formations was failing catastrophically against an enemy who now brought his own fighter cover all the way to the target and back. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring had built the German Air Force from nothing into the most feared aviation power in Europe. He had assured Hitler that enemy bombers would never reach German cities. Now American fighters were appearing over the capital itself. When interrogated after the war by General Karl Spaatz on May 10, 1945, at Augsburg, Göring admitted what he had realized in those dark months of 1944. The reason for the failure of the Luftwaffe against the Allied air forces, he said, was the success of the American air forces in putting out a long-range escort fighter airplane, which enabled bombers to penetrate deep into Reich territory and still have constant and strong fighter cover. Without this escort, the air offensive would never have succeeded. We then knew we must develop the jet planes. The Mustang had changed everything, and the Germans knew it because they had flown it themselves. The story of how the Luftwaffe came to possess American P-51 Mustangs begins with the chaos of aerial combat over occupied Europe. Aircraft were lost for many reasons beyond enemy action. Mechanical failures struck without warning. Fuel exhaustion left pilots gliding toward hostile territory. Navigation errors in poor weather sent formations far off course. Adverse weather closed in suddenly, forcing pilots to land wherever they could. When an Allied aircraft came down relatively intact, German salvage teams moved quickly to recover it before other Allied planes could destroy the evidence. The Luftwaffe maintained specialized units called Bergebataillone, salvage battalions whose task was to investigate crash sites and recover usable enemy equipment. These teams operated under constant pressure because they knew that downed Allied aircraft attracted strafing attacks from other Allied planes trying to destroy them before the Germans could haul them away. Speed was essential. A promising wreck might be dismantled and loaded onto trucks within hours of landing. The salvage crews developed efficient procedures for assessing damaged aircraft, documenting their condition, and transporting recoverable components to repair facilities. Recovered aircraft were transported to facilities at Göttingen, where German technicians assessed their condition and determined whether they could be made flyable. Those deemed suitable for flight testing were assigned to specialized evaluation units. The most important of these was a remarkable organization known as Zirkus Rosarius. The name meant Rosarius Circus after its founder, Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, an experienced pre-war test pilot who understood that theoretical knowledge meant little compared to practical experience. The unit's official designation was Second Staffel, Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, the second squadron of the experimental unit of Luftwaffe High Command. Established in 1943 at the sustained instigation of General Adolf Galland, who commanded German fighter forces, the unit served a unique and innovative purpose. Rather than simply writing technical reports, that might gather dust in filing cabinets. Rosarius and his pilots would bring actual enemy aircraft to operational Luftwaffe bases. They would demonstrate these machines to frontline pilots who faced them in combat every day. Formation leaders would be permitted to fly mock combat against the captured aircraft. They could see for themselves how the enemy performed, learn its strengths and weaknesses, and develop countermeasures based on direct experience rather than second-hand accounts or theoretical analysis. The unit operated initially from Oranienburg near Berlin before relocating to Göttingen in 1944 as the war situation deteriorated. All aircraft operated by Zirkus Rosarius carried the unit code T9, making them instantly recognizable. German technicians typically retained the original Allied camouflage to maintain authenticity during demonstrations, but painted the undersides and tail surfaces bright yellow in RLM 04 color, the standard marking to prevent friendly fire incidents. Luftwaffe pilots and anti-aircraft gunners were trained to recognize this marking and hold their fire. The sight of American and British fighters lined up alongside German machines at Luftwaffe airfields created a surreal atmosphere that veterans remembered for decades afterward. Pilots who had tried to kill each other in the skies found their machines parked wingtip to wingtip on German grass. The most thoroughly documented P-51 capture involved an aircraft with serial number 42-1-03458. This was a P-51 C5NT variant, and its pilot was Lieutenant Thomas Todd of the 318th Fighter Squadron, 325th Fighter Group, flying escort missions from bases in Italy as part of the 15th Air Force. On December 9, 1944, Todd was attempting to assist another pilot who had crash-landed when adverse weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. Unable to find his way back to friendly territory, Todd made the decision to land wheels down rather than bail out into unknown terrain. The aircraft touched down intact in Austria near the Hungarian border. German forces quickly seized both the pilot and his aircraft. Todd became a prisoner of war. His Mustang became one of the most valuable intelligence prizes the Luftwaffe captured during the entire conflict. This aircraft, assigned the German code T9+CK, was transported to Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central flight test facility located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin near Lake Müritz. Rechlin was the German equivalent of Britain's Royal Aircraft Establishment, or America's Wright Field, a sprawling complex dedicated to testing and evaluating aircraft of all types. The facility had been designated the official Luftwaffe testing ground on February 26, 1935, and had grown into an enormous installation. The core airfield covered 234 hectares, with satellite fields at Rogentin and Lars, for specialized testing that required isolation or unusual facilities. The datasheets produced at Rechlin were considered so reliable that aviation historians still consult them today when researching aircraft performance. It was at Rechlin that Hans Werner Lerche conducted his evaluation of the captured Mustang. Lerche approached the aircraft without the benefit of pilot operating manuals or technical documentation. German test pilots learned aircraft characteristics through direct experimentation, carefully exploring the flight envelope while remaining alert for dangerous handling characteristics. The absence of written guidance made their work more dangerous, but also ensured their assessments reflected actual rather than theoretical performance. Lerche's verdict on the P-51 was clear. He considered it among the most impressive Allied fighters he encountered during his extensive testing career, which included evaluations of aircraft from Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. His book, published in Germany in 1977 under the title Test Pilot auf Beuteflugzeugen, documented his conclusions for posterity. The English edition appeared in 1980 from Jane's Publishing as Luftwaffe Test Pilot, flying captured Allied aircraft of World War II. A second P-51 capture occurred on D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, amid the chaos of the Normandy invasion. Second Lieutenant Thomas Fraser of the 334th Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, was flying his aircraft nicknamed Jerry over northern France when he went down near Cambrai. The P-51 B-15, with serial number 43-24825, was recovered by German forces and assigned the code T9+HK. This aircraft was put to immediate practical use, demonstrating enemy capabilities to Axis pilots. The Germans sent it to Neuruppin airfield, where Zirkus Rosarius personnel used it to train Hungarian fighter units on how to employ their Focke-Wulf 190s effectively against Mustangs. Hungary had joined the Axis powers and contributed fighter units to the defense of Reich airspace. Their pilots needed to understand what they faced when American escorts appeared. Hungarian pilots were shown the American fighter's characteristics firsthand, learning its acceleration profile, turn rate at various speeds and altitudes, and climb performance through direct observation. They could watch the Mustang maneuver and compare its performance to their own aircraft. They could practice intercept tactics against a real enemy machine rather than imagining how such an engagement might unfold. The captured Jerry remained operational until December 10, 1944, when it was lost in an accident that killed its German pilot, Oberleutnant Leo Potjans. The circumstances of the crash are unclear, but captured aircraft were inherently dangerous to fly. Maintenance was difficult without proper parts or documentation. Pilots were unfamiliar with cockpit layouts and handling characteristics. The risks were substantial. The Luftwaffe ultimately operated at least 6 documented P-51 aircraft, including P-51B, C, and D variants. These machines provided German evaluators with comprehensive data on the fighter that was systematically destroying their air force. The intelligence gathered was thorough and accurate. What the Germans lacked was any effective means to apply it. The technical findings from Rechlin and Zirkus Rosarius painted a grim picture for the Luftwaffe. German test pilots confirmed what combat experience had already suggested. The P-51 possessed a combination of speed, range, and high-altitude performance that no German piston engine fighter could match. Each advantage compounded the others, creating an aircraft that dominated the air war not through any single overwhelming quality, but through excellence across multiple performance parameters. Speed was the first obvious advantage. The P-51B and D models achieved approximately 440 miles per hour at 24,500 feet when operating at war emergency power, decisively faster than both the Messerschmitt 109G and the Focke-Wulf 190A at most combat altitudes. The difference was not marginal. A German pilot who found a Mustang on his tail could not simply outrun it. If the American chose to pursue, he would catch his quarry. Kurt Buhligen experienced this reality firsthand. Buhligen scored 112 aerial victories during the war, fighting on the Western Front and in North Africa. He was among the highest-scoring German aces who faced American opponents, and 3 of his victories were P-51 Mustangs. His assessment of the aircraft was professional and candid. "We would outturn the P-51 and the other American fighters with the Bf-109 or the FW-190, he said in post-war interviews. Their turn rate was about the same. The P-51 was faster than us, but our munitions and cannon were better. German evaluators noted that the Mustang's laminar flow wing design contributed significantly to its speed advantage. The wing had been developed by North American aviation engineers using advanced aerodynamic principles that were still novel when the aircraft was designed. The airfoil shape reduced drag at high speeds by maintaining smooth, laminar airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface than conventional designs achieved. The result was an aircraft that sliced through the air more efficiently than its German counterparts, converting engine power into forward speed with minimal waste. But speed alone did not explain why the P-51 had transformed the air war. The critical advantage was range, and the difference was not incremental, but revolutionary. With external drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. No previous Allied fighter had come close to this capability. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could accompany bomber formations as far as the Belgian or Dutch border, perhaps 200 miles into hostile territory. Beyond that point, the heavy bombers flew unprotected. The Luftwaffe had exploited this limitation ruthlessly through 1943. German fighter controllers tracked incoming bomber formations by radar and plotted their courses. They knew approximately where the American escorts would turn back for lack of fuel. Interceptor units positioned themselves to attack after the escorts departed. The bombers, stripped of their protection, suffered terrible losses. Formations that crossed into Germany faced concentrated attacks from fresh German fighters operating close to their own bases. The P-51 nullified this entire defensive system. Now German fighters rising to intercept bomber formations found themselves engaged by American escorts over their own territory. The calculations that had governed Luftwaffe interception tactics became worthless. The comfortable hunting ground beyond escort range ceased to exist. Home defense interceptors that had inflicted such heavy losses on unescorted bombers were suddenly fighting for their lives against nimble single-engine fighters that could match them in a dogfight and exceed them in level flight. German technical intelligence had calculated the P-51's range by measuring captured aircraft fuel tank capacity against known engine consumption figures. The math was straightforward and inescapable. A P-51 carried 269 gallons of fuel internally, including 85 gallons in the fuselage tank behind the pilot and 184 gallons in the wing tanks. With two 75-gallon external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings, total fuel capacity reached 419 gallons. The Packard Merlin engine consumed approximately 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise settings. The arithmetic was simple, even accounting for fuel consumed during combat maneuvering at higher power settings. The practical combat radius exceeded 400 miles. When larger 108-gallon drop tanks became standard issue, the radius extended further still, enough to reach any target in Germany from bases in England. The external tanks were remarkable in their simplicity and economy. American factories produced millions of disposable drop tanks that could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. Early versions were made of pressed paper and impregnated with sealant. Later versions used lightweight metal. The tanks were designed to be thrown away. Pilots released them when entering combat or when they ran dry, and the tanks simply fell into occupied territory below. The logistics of supplying these tanks required shipping them across the Atlantic by the millions, distributing them to dozens of airfields, and mounting them on thousands of aircraft before each mission. It was an industrial achievement that represented American manufacturing philosophy applied to warfare. High-altitude performance proved equally troubling for German evaluators. The P-51's Packard Wölfe 1657 engine The American-built version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin produced 1,490 horsepower at military power settings and 1,720 horsepower when war emergency power was engaged. These figures were respectable but not dramatically superior to German engines of similar displacement. The difference lay in how that power was maintained at altitude. The engine's decisive advantage was its two-stage, two-speed, centrifugal supercharger, developed by Sir Stanley Hooker at Rolls-Royce and incorporated into the Packard production version. A supercharger compresses air before it enters the engine's cylinders, maintaining power as the aircraft climbs into thinner atmosphere. Single-stage superchargers, used in German engines, worked well at lower altitudes but became increasingly inadequate as air pressure dropped. The Merlin's two-stage design incorporated a second compressor stage that maintained near sea-level atmospheric pressure in the cylinders at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. German engines used single-stage superchargers optimized for lower altitudes where most tactical combat occurred. The Daimler-Benz DB605 that powered the Messerschmitt 109 G series displaced 35.7 litres compared to the Merlin's 27 litres. It produced 1,475 horsepower at rated altitude, figures that actually exceeded the smaller British-designed engine on paper. But above 20,000 feet, the German engine's power fell off rapidly, while the Merlin maintained its output. This meant that at typical bomber escort, altitudes of 25,000 to 35,000 feet, where heavy bombers flew to avoid light anti-aircraft fire, the P-51 had power available that German interceptors lacked. A 109 pilot who held the advantage in a turning fight at 15,000 feet might find himself hopelessly outclassed when the combat drifted to higher altitudes, where his engine gasped for air while the Americans' Merlin sang at full power. The Germans were not blind to this deficiency in their aero engines. Engineers at Junkers worked to develop the Jumo 213E and F variants, incorporating two-stage superchargers with intercoolers, addressing the high-altitude weakness that combat had exposed. Daimler-Benz pursued similar developments with the DB603 series, but these advanced engines entered service too late and in insufficient numbers to affect the outcome of the air war. The production lines were tooled for existing engine types. Changing over meant disrupting output at precisely the moment when every aircraft counted. There was one area where German evaluators found genuine consolation in their assessment of the P-51. The Mustang's turning radius was demonstrably larger than that of the Messerschmitt 109 at certain speeds and altitudes. In a sustained turning fight at medium altitudes, a skilled German pilot could potentially gain angles on a Mustang. The lighter, more compact German fighter could pull tighter turns and potentially work into a firing position against an opponent who tried to dogfight on German terms. Buhligen noted this in his assessment when he observed that the turn rates were about the same, but the 109 could outturn the Mustang under certain conditions. But this advantage was difficult to exploit in practice against well-trained American pilots who understood their own aircraft's strengths. American fighter doctrine emphasized energy tactics rather than turning fights. Pilots were trained to use their speed advantage aggressively, diving through German formations at high velocity, making a firing pass, and zoom climbing away before German pilots could react and bring their guns to bear. If a 109 tried to follow a P-51 in a steep dive, the American could simply accelerate away. The Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and higher critical Mach number allowed it to dive faster, without encountering compressibility problems that affected some German types. If the German tried to climb after a Mustang that was pulling away, The Americans' superior power at altitude allowed it to extend the distance until the pursuer gave up or ran low on fuel. The P-51's cockpit drew particular attention from German evaluators, who were accustomed to the relatively austere layouts of Luftwaffe fighters. The American instrument panel was crowded with gauges, switches, and controls for systems that German aircraft simply lacked. There were controls for the two-stage supercharger, requiring the pilot to select high or low blower settings at appropriate altitudes. There were controls for the propeller governor, cowl flaps, oil cooler shutters, and intercooler shutters. Fuel tank selectors allowed the pilot to draw from internal tanks, drop tanks, or fuselage tanks in various combinations. German pilots who flew the captured Mustangs found this complexity both impressive and somewhat puzzling. The Messerschmitt 109 cockpit was designed with German efficiency in mind, everything close to the pilot's hands, simple and direct. The Mustang required substantially more attention to systems management throughout a flight. German evaluators wondered how American pilots found time to manage so many controls while also fighting for their lives against skilled opponents. What they did not fully appreciate was that American training programs drilled systems management until it became automatic, requiring no conscious thought under normal circumstances. American pilots practiced their cockpit procedures until reaching for the correct switch became as natural as breathing. This freed their attention for tactics and situational awareness during combat. The complexity that puzzled German evaluators was tamed through training that the increasingly desperate Luftwaffe could no longer provide to its own pilots. The armament comparison favored German fighters in raw firepower, but American fighters in practical combat effectiveness. The P-51D carried 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with varying ammunition loads depending on position. The inboard guns carried approximately 400 rounds each, while the center and outboard guns carried roughly 270 rounds each, giving a total of approximately 1,880 rounds. This provided American pilots with substantial trigger time, far more than German fighters carried. The Browning machine guns were reliable, accurate, and provided a dense pattern of fire that was forgiving of aiming errors. A pilot who was slightly off target might still score hits. The 50 caliber round was powerful enough to damage any aircraft component it struck. Though it lacked the explosive punch of cannon shells, American pilots were trained to fire concentrated bursts, walking their tracers onto target and holding the trigger until they saw strikes. German fighters typically carried a mix of 20mm MG 151 cannon and 13mm MG 131 machine guns. Later variants added 30mm Mk 108 cannon with devastating destructive power. A single 30mm shell could tear a bomber's wing off. 2 or 3 hits from these heavy cannon were enough to destroy any aircraft in the sky. But the cannon had severely limited ammunition. A Messerschmitt 109 might carry 60 to 150 rounds for its nose-mounted cannon, giving the pilot only 2 or 3 seconds of firing time. This demanded precise gunnery under the extreme stress of combat, requiring the pilot to close to point-blank range and place his shots perfectly in the brief moment a firing opportunity presented itself. Such accuracy was a skill that required years of training and combat experience to develop. As the war progressed, and experienced German pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced, the advantage shifted decisively toward the American armament philosophy. New German pilots with minimal training struggled to score hits with their cannon in the brief frantic moments of a firing opportunity. They would blaze through their ammunition without effect and then become defenseless. American pilots with similar limited experience could spray their targets with hundreds of rounds, dramatically increasing the probability of scoring damaging hits through sheer volume of fire. The evaluation reports from Rechlin and Zirkus Rosarius reached Luftwaffe command through proper channels, but the intelligence arrived amid a strategic catastrophe that no amount of tactical adjustment could reverse. By the time captured Mustangs were being systematically tested at German facilities, the aircraft's capabilities had already transformed the air war over Europe beyond any possibility of recovery. The turning point came in late February 1944. During a massive Allied air offensive, the Americans designated Operation Argument, though it became better known as Big Week. Over 6 days from February 20th to February 25th, combined bomber forces of the 8th Air Force flying from England and the 15th Air Force flying from Italy launched a sustained, coordinated assault on German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. American bombers flew approximately 3,800 sorties during Big Week, with the United States Army Air Forces dropping approximately 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft factories, assembly plants, engine works, and component manufacturers. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators struck targets from Brunswick to Leipzig to Regensburg to Augsburg. The offensive hit nearly every significant aircraft production center within range. The cost in American lives was heavy. 137 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force and 89 from the 15th Air Force were shot down. A total of 226 aircraft lost. More than 2,600 American airmen were killed, wounded, captured, or listed as missing. By any previous standard of aerial warfare, these losses might have been considered unsustainable, but the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophically from the same battle. German fighters rose in strength to defend their industrial heartland and were cut down by the escorting Mustangs, Thunderbolts and Lightnings that now accompanied the bomber formations deep into Reich territory. In 6 days of savage air combat, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 17% of its fighter pilots. Roughly 100 experienced aviators were killed in less than a week. These were not novices, they were the veterans whose skills had been honed over years of combat. They could not be quickly replaced. The mathematics of attrition now favored the Allies with crushing finality. In May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 489 trained fighter pilots, while German flying schools produced only 396 replacements. The deficit of nearly 100 pilots in a single month represented a hemorrhage that would never close. The following months showed similar or worse imbalances. For the entire year of 1944, German dayfighter pilot attrition approached 90%. German aircraft production actually peaked in 1944 at approximately 36,000 combat aircraft, a remarkable achievement of Albert Speer's industrial management under increasingly difficult conditions. Factories dispersed to avoid bombing continued to turn out airframes. Assembly lines that had been wrecked were rebuilt and resumed production. On paper, the Luftwaffe was receiving more aircraft than ever before, but these aircraft increasingly sat on airfields without fuel because Allied bombers had systematically wrecked the synthetic oil plants that produced aviation gasoline. When they did manage to fly, they were piloted by men with tragically inadequate training because the experienced pilots who should have taught them were dead. An air force needs more than aircraft. It needs fuel to fly them and trained men to fly them well. Germany had neither. The contrast with American pilot training was stark and decisive. The United States Army Air Forces operated an industrial-scale training establishment that processed hundreds of thousands of young men through carefully designed programs. Primary training taught basic flight skills. Basic training added instrument flying and formation work. Advanced training introduced combat tactics and gunnery. The entire system was designed for throughput, moving cadets through each phase efficiently while maintaining quality standards. American flight schools had abundant aircraft because the same factories that built combat planes also produced trainers in vast quantities. Fuel was plentiful because American oil production faced no threat from enemy action. Instructors included experienced combat veterans rotated home from overseas theaters who brought hard-won tactical knowledge to their students. The training infrastructure continued to expand even as the war approached its climax. A new American pilot arriving in England in 1944 might have accumulated 300 hours of flight time and several hundred hours of ground instruction in meteorology, navigation, aircraft recognition, and other subjects. He had fired his guns at towed targets and learned to judge deflection angles. He had practiced formation flying until holding position became automatic. He had engaged in mock dogfights against instructors who knew enemy tactics. He was not a veteran, but he was competent and ready to learn. A new German pilot in the same period might have 80 hours of total flight time, perhaps less. Fuel shortages had forced severe cutbacks in training curricula. There were not enough qualified instructors because experienced pilots could not be spared from frontline units that were bleeding men daily. Ground school was abbreviated. Gunnery practice was minimal. The young men climbing into Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in late 1944 were often barely qualified to fly their aircraft, let alone fight skilled opponents in them. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters who commanded Luftwaffe day fighter operations, watched this deterioration with growing alarm and frustration. He had helped establish Zirkus Rosarius precisely because he understood that German pilots needed every possible advantage against an enemy whose numbers and training increasingly outmatched them. The captured aircraft demonstrations were one attempt to help his men survive. Galland's conflict with higher command became a central drama of the Luftwaffe's final years. He repeatedly warned that American long-range fighters were destroying the day fighter force faster than it could regenerate. His warnings were dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed by superiors who preferred comfortable delusions to painful truths. The most infamous example occurred toward the end of 1943, when Galland reported that American fighters had been encountered deep over Liege, far beyond the range anyone believed escort fighters could reach. The implications were obvious and alarming. If American fighters could reach Liege, they would soon reach the Ruhr, then central Germany, then Berlin itself. The entire defensive strategy of the Reich was based on assumptions that were suddenly obsolete. Göring's response, recorded in Albert Speer's Nuremberg testimony of June 1946, was to deny reality by official decree. "I herewith give you an official order that they were not there," Göring declared. "Do you understand? The American fighters were not there." Galland could only reply with bitter irony, "Orders are orders, sir." This institutional denial persisted even as evidence mounted beyond any reasonable doubt. The Luftwaffe Technical Service had calculated the P-51's potential range from measurements of captured aircraft, but the intelligence appears to have been ignored or dismissed at higher levels until the situation became undeniable. By then, of course, it was far too late to develop effective countermeasures. The P-51's dominance was reflected in combat statistics that accumulated relentlessly throughout 1944 and into 1945. The Mustang consistently achieved higher kill ratios than other American fighter types in the same theater, flying similar missions. Its combination of range, speed, and maneuverability made it exceptionally effective against German interceptors, who had previously enjoyed advantages of position and numbers against unescorted bombers. The 4th Fighter Group exemplified what the P-51 could accomplish in skilled hands. The unit had been formed from American volunteers who had joined the Royal Air Force before the United States entered the war, flying Spitfires with the famous Eagle squadrons. They transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts when the 8th Air Force formed, then converted again to P-51 Mustangs as that aircraft became available in quantity. On March 4, 1944, pilots of the 4th Fighter Group became the first single-engine fighters to escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of 1,100 miles. The mission demonstrated capabilities that had seemed impossible only months before. By the end of the war, the group had destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and strafing attacks, more than any other American fighter unit in any theater. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force had converted to P-51 Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained its original P-47 Thunderbolts through the end of the war, and even they acknowledged the Mustang's superiority for the long-range escort mission that had become the American fighter force's primary task. Total P-51 claims in the European theatre reached approximately 4,950 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, accounting for roughly half of all American fighter claims in the theatre. An additional 4,131 enemy aircraft were claimed destroyed on the ground by Mustangs conducting strafing attacks on Luftwaffe airfields across occupied Europe and Germany itself. The fighter type that Lerche had evaluated at Rechlin was methodically dismantling the air force he served. The Luftwaffe attempted various tactical and technological responses to the Mustang threat. One approach was the Gefechtsverband formation concept, pairing heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190 Sturmgruppe assault aircraft with Messerschmitt 109 escorts. The Sturmgruppe fighters carried additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine, protecting their pilots from defensive fire during close-range attacks on bomber formations. They were equipped with heavy cannons specifically intended to destroy American heavy bombers with a few well-placed hits. The concept was tactically sound in theory. The armoured Sturmgruppe aircraft would bore in to point-blank range against the bomber formations, while the escorting 109s kept American fighters away from them. But the system proved impossible to execute consistently against alert and aggressive Mustang formations. The heavily armoured Sturmgruppe aircraft were sluggish and poorly suited to air combat. If they were caught by American fighters before they could attack the bombers, they became easy targets. The escorting 109s were often hopelessly outnumbered by superior numbers of P-51s and could not protect their charges. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter offered a technological leap that might theoretically neutralize the Mustang's advantages. Its twin jet engines propelled the aircraft to speeds between 540 and 560 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than any propeller-driven fighter could achieve. 430mm Mk-108 cannon provided devastating firepower capable of destroying a heavy bomber with 2 or 3 hits. In theory, the jets could slash through American bomber formations with impunity, too fast for propeller-driven escorts to intercept. In practice, the revolutionary aircraft faced practical limitations that prevented it from changing the outcome of the air war. The jets were complex and unreliable. Their engines had short service lives and demanded high maintenance. Production never reached the numbers needed to challenge American air superiority. Most critically, the jets were desperately vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when their speed advantage vanished entirely. A Me-262 accelerating down the runway or settling toward the ground after a mission was no faster than a 109 and far less maneuverable. American pilots quickly learned to loiter at altitude near known jet bases, waiting to pounce on the revolutionary aircraft at their most vulnerable moments. The Luftwaffe was forced to station conventional fighters in combat air patrol over jet airfields to protect them, consuming scarce resources and pilots to solve a problem created by the very weapons that were supposed to provide salvation. Aircraft designer Kurt personally experienced the performance gap between state-of-the-art German and American fighters in late 1944. Tank was more than an engineer. He was a skilled pilot who regularly flew the aircraft he designed. On a ferry flight in an unarmed TAR-152H prototype from Langenhagen near Hanover to Cottbus, Tank received a warning from ground control that enemy fighters were approaching his position. Looking behind him, Tank saw the distinctive silhouettes of Mustangs closing on his unarmed aircraft. He had no weapons and no escort. His only chance was to outrun them. Tank engaged the MW-50 methanol water boost injection system and opened the throttle to maximum emergency power. The TA-152H was designed specifically as a high-altitude fighter, with a long wingspan and a powerful Jumo 213E engine optimized for performance above 30,000 feet. With boost engaged, the aircraft accelerated away from the pursuing Mustangs, leaving them behind within minutes. Tank survived to tell the story, but his escape illustrated how few options remained. The TAR-152 represented the pinnacle of German piston engine fighter development, yet it entered service only in January 1945 with the first delivery to Jagdgeschwader 301 on January 27th. It was produced in negligible numbers, far too few to affect the outcome of the air war. Operation Bodenplatte on January 1st, 1945, represented the Luftwaffe's final attempt at a major offensive operation. Over 1,000 German fighters gathered in secrecy to attack Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France in a coordinated surprise assault timed for New Year's morning, when Allied pilots would presumably be recovering from celebrations. The operation achieved tactical surprise and significant destruction, with estimates of Allied aircraft destroyed ranging from 305 to nearly 500, depending on which accounting is accepted. But the cost to the Luftwaffe itself was catastrophic and utterly irreplaceable. 234 German pilots were lost, including 143 killed or missing, 70 captured, and 21 wounded. Among the dead were 3 Geschwaderkommandeur wing commanders, 5 Gruppenkommandeur group commanders, and more than 14 Staffelkapitani squadron leaders. These were the experienced men who held units together, who trained new pilots, who knew from hard experience how to survive against long odds. Their loss in a single day accelerated the collapse that was already well underway. Adolf Galland, who had opposed the operation, assessed the damage bluntly. "We sacrificed our last substance," he said. The German fighter force received its death blow. The Luftwaffe could not recover from losing so many irreplaceable experienced leaders in a single operation, no matter how many aircraft the factories continued to produce. Within weeks, remaining Luftwaffe units were reduced to sporadic operations, unable to mount consistent defense against Allied air forces that now roamed over Germany at will. The German evaluation of the P-51 Mustang had been thorough, professional, and accurate in every respect. Test pilots like Hans Werner Lerche correctly identified the aircraft's strengths in speed, range, and high-altitude performance. Zirkus Rosarius disseminated this intelligence to frontline units through innovative demonstration programs that allowed pilots to see the enemy's capabilities directly. The technical data sheets produced at Rechlin remain valuable historical sources that aviation researchers consult to this day when seeking reliable performance figures, yet the intelligence arrived amid a strategic catastrophe that no amount of tactical adjustment could reverse. The P-51's combination of capabilities had given the Allies a decisive instrument at precisely the moment when American industrial production reached its overwhelming peak. The factories that built Mustangs by the thousands also produced the high-octane fuel to fly them, the ammunition to arm them, the spare parts to maintain them, and trained the pilots to fly them into combat. Germany built more aircraft in 1944 than in any previous year of the war, an achievement of desperate industrial improvisation under impossible conditions. But without fuel to fly them and trained pilots to man them effectively, these aircraft represented monuments to futility rather than instruments of defense. The Luftwaffe had evaluated the P-51 and understood exactly why it was losing control of the skies. Understanding changed nothing. Erprobungsstelle. Rechlin, where Lerche had carefully tested the captured Mustang, was itself attacked by 273 American bombers on April 10, 1945. The facility that had evaluated so many enemy aircraft was destroyed from the air by the same forces it had hoped to defeat. German forces evacuated the site by late April and demolished what remained, rather than allow it to fall intact to Soviet troops, who arrived on May 2nd. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war and the chaos that followed. His memoir documented his extraordinary experiences testing captured Allied aircraft throughout the conflict. The book remains an essential primary source for understanding how German aviation professionals assessed their enemies. Lerche had flown approximately 125 different aircraft types across 6 years of war without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single machine, a record that testified to his exceptional skill and caution. His evaluation of the P-51 was not propaganda or speculation, but the professional assessment of a master of his craft. The P-51 Mustangs that Zirkus Rosarius had demonstrated across German airfields ended the war scattered, destroyed, or captured in turn. The aircraft nicknamed Jerry that had trained Hungarian pilots was lost in its December crash. Other examples were destroyed in Allied air raids that struck German airfields with increasing frequency. Some were abandoned during the chaotic retreats of the war's final weeks. The men who flew for Zirkus Rosarius largely faded into anonymity after the war ended. Theodore Rosarius survived and returned to civilian existence in a devastated Germany that offered few opportunities and preferred to forget the recent past. The pilots who had risked their lives demonstrating captured Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, and heavy bombers to Luftwaffe units went back to whatever peacetime existence they could construct from the ruins. Their unique contribution to aviation history remained little known outside specialist circles for decades. The lesson of what they discovered carries weight beyond the specific circumstances of aerial combat over Europe 8 decades ago. The German evaluation of the P-51 Mustang was not a failure of intelligence. It was a triumph of intelligence gathering and analysis that could not overcome a failure of strategy and resources. German test pilots accurately assessed the threat confronting their nation. German technical officers correctly calculated the range capabilities that made the threat possible. German commanders received detailed reports that explained precisely why they were losing control of the skies over their homeland. None of it mattered because the underlying strategic situation was beyond remedy through tactical means. The Americans could produce more aircraft, train more pilots, refine better fuel, and sustain higher losses than Germany could match. The P-51 was not merely a superior fighter aircraft. It was the visible edge of an industrial civilization that had mobilized resources beyond anything Germany could counter. Göring's admission to Spatz after the war captured this reality with painful clarity. The long-range escort fighter had made the strategic bombing offensive possible. Without it, American bombers could never have sustained the systematic campaign that wrecked German industry, destroyed German oil production, paralyzed German transportation networks, and made continued resistance impossible. The P-51 Mustang did not win the air war alone, but without the P-51, the air war could not have been won. History matters because patterns persist across time. Nations still evaluate their adversaries and sometimes still fail to act effectively on what they discover. Intelligence organizations still produce accurate assessments that are ignored because they contradict what political leaders prefer to believe. The gap between knowing and doing remains as wide today as it was when German pilots flew captured Mustangs and understood exactly what they faced. They wrote their reports and filed their recommendations and watched helplessly as the force they served was ground to pieces by an enemy they had measured precisely but could not defeat. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their descendants to history enthusiasts discovering these events for the first time. You are part of something important here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.